Greetings, ladies and gentlefish, and welcome to another tank review. This time looking at the Type 5 Japanese medium tank, the Chi-Nu. I never got around to reviewing this thing, I don't think, when I did my previous Japanese tank reviews, because if memory serves, I started making YouTube videos when I was at the tier 6 on this line, so this one kind of got skipped over. Anyway, we're going to kick off as normal with just a little bit of a historical background, and we're actually going to start off on this particular occasion, whoops, that's the wrong thing, having a look at the details that are provided about the tank in the game client. Don't know why I clicked on statistics there, because I'm a little bit special. So it says here, the Type 3 Chi-Nu medium tank is a modification of the Type 1 Chi-He with a new turret and gun. The Chi-He, by the way, I believe is the Japanese tier 4. The tank was the most powerful among wartime Japanese mass-produced vehicles, however only 60 vehicles were manufactured due to shortages of components and materials. Now I actually find it really interesting to have a look at stuff that was produced by the Japanese during the Second World War, and I guess stuff that was used in the Pacific theatre in general, and that description alludes to the reason why. So, I'm a European, for anyone who isn't aware. I'm a Brit, and I think we Europeans have a habit of taking a very Eurocentric view of the Second World War, which is perhaps understandable because we had the literal Nazis on our doorstep. Honest to goodness Nazis. But the Second World War was not restricted to Europe. You had the entire Pacific theatre, against Japan, of course. And we tend to sort of gloss over that quite a lot. And you get this reputation for Japanese tanks, Japanese armour, as being inferior to those made by everyone else. A reputation that I don't think is really justified. I think it's more indicative of the conditions in which they were fighting. So if you have a look in sort of the Southeast Asian area of conflict, I suppose, the theatre of war, a couple of things become apparent. You have sort of two main regions. One, if you're going out across the Pacific, either east from mainland Asia, or south or southeast from mainland Asia, you're essentially island hopping. So there is an awful lot of an emphasis placed on your navy and your logistics, your supply and all that jazz. If you're looking at the mainland Asia conflict, I mean, have you ever seen pictures taken from places like Burma and other regions of Southeast Asia? There's quite a lot there that's sort of dense, subtropical foliage. And good luck driving a tiger tank through the Burmese jungle. It's just not going to work. The thing is far too big, it's far too heavy, and stuff gets in the way. And so the actual equipment requirements for the Pacific theatre were very different from the European theatre. And so I think people have a tendency to look at the equipment used in the European theatre, the Tiger tank is a prime example, and go, oh my god, the Tiger tank's so amazing, oh look at what the Japanese made, oh they were all kind of small little light tanks, they didn't make anything, oh it's not a Tiger. But it's a very different set of situations and circumstances in which they're operating. You notice this with the Americans, for example. They make much more use of the M3 light tank in the Pacific. For the Brits, the Matilda, which they'd past about 1941 come to the conclusion wasn't really fit for the fight against the Germans anymore, because the Germans would just wheel out an 88mm flak gun and punch a hole straight through the thing, even though it dominated the very early years of the war. But the Matilda take that out to the Pacific theatre, and suddenly you have a relatively well-armoured and small tank capable of getting where you need it to go. The 40mm gun, the 2-pounder gun, was perfectly adequate for dealing with the relatively light Japanese armour, and the Matilda's armour was quite difficult to deal with for the Japanese. Well, why didn't the Japanese just use bigger and bigger guns? Because bigger and bigger guns are heavy. And again, you've got to lug all this through thick jungle, or up a mountain, or from island to island to island. So there's much more of a focus on lighter vehicles, including some amphibious vehicles that are actually really interesting in and of their own right. Anyway, I'm waffling. The point I'm trying to get at is the Chi-Nu here. If you look at it in terms of what it was designed to achieve and its capabilities, you kind of look at it and go, it's a Japanese Sherman. I mean, it's got, what, 50 odd millimeters of armour, Okay, fine. It's got a 75mm gun, and the historical gun, which is not the top gun on this thing in-game, the historical gun is roughly comparable with the M3 75mm gun found on the early Shermans. It's lighter than the Sherman. This thing clocks in, somewhere around 10 tons lighter. And it's a bit smaller, but in terms of capabilities, it's very similar to the Sherman, and that shouldn't necessarily come as a surprise. The Brits had the Cavaliers and the Cromwells that were very similar to the Shermans. The Germans had the Panzer IV, which when they gave it an anti-tank gun worth a damn, was very similar to the Sherman. The Soviets had the T-34. But what's interesting is that all of those machines were early to mid-war. This thing was not. So the Sherman was, seeing action in 1942, for example, as was the T-34, for instance. Panzer IV had been around a while, but initially it was a support tank, later on it was given a larger gun. This thing was designed in 1943 and was made in 1944, so when you see in the in-game description, they're talking about a lack of parts, lack of components and materials. That's because this is a late war tank. Japan is losing at this point. The Americans are kicking their faces in because they've got themselves in a long protracted war with what would become an economic superpower. So this thing, in terms of its when it was introduced, the Tiger was first seen in 1942. The Panther in late 1942, maybe 1943. This thing was introduced in 1944. What other tanks were introduced at a similar sort of time? The Comet was 1944, late 44, I think. So this is obviously a much lighter design than any of those, and again, that just lends itself to the kind of wider context of the theatre of war in which the Japanese were fighting. I just find it interesting. That's all. Very, very different situation that the Japanese found themselves in, and so they used very, very different equipment. And so this was introduced, and at the time at which it was introduced, it wouldn't have been obsolete in Europe, but it would have been met with a big fat heap of, we've got loads of tanks like that, what are you getting at? But this was, when it was introduced with the 75mm gun, this was the most powerful, or at least one of the most powerful anti-tank guns fielded by the Japanese army in the Second World War. Anyway, there we go. A little bit of interest for you. So, we're going to go and have a look at the stats of this thing in-game. I promise I've finished rabbiting about history. And I'm going to compare this with a couple of machines that I think have some similarities, and hopefully you'll see what I mean, and we'll look at standard things like armour and whatnot. So, let's just compare then. If we have a look at the stats, we're going to compare the Chinu to the M4A1 Sherman, that's the Tier 5 American medium tank, and I've got it here equipped with the 76mm gun, and the Skoda T24. I'm trying to compare it with tanks that I think are relatively comparable. So straight away you can see that this has the best DPM of the lot. It's not beating the Sherman by a vast amount. The Sherman has about 1500 base DPM, the Chinu 1560. But the Skoda just has woeful DPM, so there's that. Penetration, strictly speaking, this is the lowest of this comparison, but bear in mind I am explicitly comparing it to the two Tier 5 medium tanks with higher penetration. So 124 penetration, whilst it's worse than the other two slightly, it's still not bad. It's only 4mm worse than the American tank and 8 worse than the Skoda. Alpha damage, 125, that's pretty good for a Tier 5 medium tanks, armour-piercing gun. It's anti-tank gun, so that's pretty decent. Module damage, because technically the American gun is slightly higher caliber, the American gun being a 76mm and both the Chinu and the Skoda having 75mm guns, the American gets slightly higher module damage. It's probably not going to make a huge amount of difference though. Lower rate of fire on the Chinu, but that higher alpha damage does make up for it, giving it that higher DPM. But I would like to point out that although the American gun does get a higher rate of fire, the Skoda, as well as getting the lowest alpha damage in this comparison at 110, also gets the worst rate of fire, hence that atrocious DPM of just under 1300. That is abysmal. Shell velocities, this is all much of a muchness, and the Chinu is in the middle of the bunch at 821. It's not terrible. It'll do the job. Ammo capacity, 60 rounds is absolutely fine as a general rule of thumb. I've never burned through all 60. The replays, in fact, I'm actually going to show you because I didn't realise this thing had been given more ammunition since I last played it. I'm actually going to be lacking ammunition in the replays. That's just because I didn't realise it had more ammo. And I did have one instance where, with a limited ammo loadout that I had been running with, I did get close to running out. But, like I said, you have more ammunition these days. Gun handling then, and, well, this is sort of a good news, bad news situation. Aim time is exactly the same across the board. Now the dispersion, so the accuracy of the gun, is the best in comparison, slightly beating the Skoda and massively beating the M4's 76mm gun. The accuracy on that gun is woeful, which is one of the reasons I do not advocate using that gun. Back that up with atrocious gun handling on the American tank, and you just use the howitzer. Anyway, this is about the Chinu. Dispersion values, moving, turret traverse, tank traverse, etc., are in the middle on this comparison, better than the American, worse than the Skoda. However, Tier 5 medium tanks suck with their gun handling as a general rule of thumb. Just because the Skoda has the best in this comparison doesn't mean the Skoda's gun handling is good. It's not. So just have that in your mind. Gun elevation is the worst in this comparison. It is quite poor. It's unusual that becomes a thing you have to pay attention to, though. Gun depression is 10 degrees, the same as the Skoda, not quite as good as the American tank. So overall, the gun handling for a Tier 5 medium tank is okay, but that's quite a low bar you're setting. Tier 5 medium tanks in general really struggle with their gun handling, and it's not until you get to the higher tiers that your gun handling gets noticeably better. Mobility, and this is where things start going a little bit wrong for the Japanese tanks, sorry. Like top speed of under 40 kilometers an hour at 38.8, that just feels so painful, especially when you consider the Skoda will do almost 60. Reverse speed of 60, it doesn't look that much worse than the other two in this comparison, but it is quite underwhelming. 300 horsepower on the engine doesn't sound like very much, but because this tank is a good deal lighter than the Sherman, it means you get actually a comparable power-to-weight ratio. In fact, actually a slightly better power-to-weight ratio than the Sherman. The Skoda is just much better in this regard, but then the Skoda inexplicably gets wrecked by its terrain resistance values for some reason I don't really understand why. And so overall, the Japanese tank, although it has the weakest engine in this comparison, actually has overall the best ground resistances, which is a bit curious, I know, but hey ho, go figure, I guess. Base traverse values, though, not fantastic, and let me just say that overall, from playing it, when you combine the uninspiring speed limit, especially going forwards, with the uninspiring traverse speeds, even though you get decent ground resistance values, at least for a Tier 5 medium tank, the overall impression is of a tank that is not very fast. Just bear that in mind. Armour then, we're going to look at this in more detail later on, but 50mm, that's not going to do a great deal of much, is it? I mean, the Sherman is not renowned for its armour, and the Sherman's armour is at least sloped, and that has 60 on the hull, so don't expect much from the armour. Track armour really doesn't matter most of the time. The other important bit here is, there's various module health values here, but the hit points of the tank at 630 is actually the highest in this comparison. Although that does feel a little bit lackluster compared to some of the premiums at Tier 5 that get more. But 630 is the highest of this comparison. Camouflage is okay. It's not as good as the Skoda. It's better than the Sherman, but the Sherman is quite a chunky tank, so go figure. Radio range is a little bit lacking, but meh. Fire chance is the lowest in this comparison. Yay. And the shell cost is also the lowest in this comparison. Yay. But the tank cost is more. So, swings and roundabouts. So overall what you get for a Tier 5 medium tank is quite a good gun. Like in this comparison I would say is easily the best gun, only losing a little bit of gun handling compared to the Skoda. The mobility leaves something to be desired, though, in the armour. Well, we're going to look at the armour, but just don't expect anything at all. Well, I did say we would look at the armour. Oh dear. Right, so, I'm not going to spend long looking at the rear and sides of this tank, but I just wanted to point out that the side armour and the rear armour on this thing is about 20mm, 25. If you know you're going to catch a Chinu from behind, high explosive is not a terrible choice. I mean, 75mm HE rounds tend to be running at about 38mm of average penetration, and 75mm guns are fairly common at tier 5. I mean, this tank has one. So, HE into the sides and the rear can really give this thing a bad day. Don't do that necessarily from the front, but sides and rear, HE is your friend. Right, I'm not going to bother pointing out like weak spots on the front of this tank because the whole tank is essentially a weak spot. 50mm of armour plate without much angling going on, 54, like no. The only bits you're really going to get bounces on is either part of this front at a decent angle, or maybe bits of the gun mantlet. Like, you can get bits that have much higher effective values, but they're very small, and you definitely shouldn't rely upon them. Using all your gun depression, well, that's all well and good, but it's not going to make this thing stand up to anything much. From a survivability perspective, at least with regard to the armour, it doesn't really make any difference. What, of course, using your gun depression will do is allow you to hide your tank more effectively, because obviously if you're, say, poking up over a ridgeline, the only thing you're exposing is the top part of your turret and that commander's hatch on top. You're not exposing the lower part of your turret and your hull, which is good. But that's it. There's no point saying anything else about the armour on this tank. It's rubbish. So I think with tech tree tanks, it's always worth having a look at what the grind is likely to be. And the grind on this tank, well, there's quite a lot of modules to get through, let's be honest. Now, this tank really is all about the gun, so I would strongly recommend you focus on the gun. The stock engine, 270 horsepower, it's a bit weaker than the fully upgraded engine, but there's relatively small differences. You want to get this top gun as quickly as you can. So how are you going to do that? Well, you come with a 57mm gun that sucks. This thing would not have been particularly impressive at tier 4, and it's not at tier 4, it's at tier 5. So you really want to get through this gun as quickly as possible. Now, you will also have this 75mm gun that you can have used on the Type 95 Heavy and the Type 1 Chi-He, which is the tier 4. So you'll already have this Type 99 75mm gun unlocked, and it is frankly just an upgrade. Well, I say it's just an upgrade over the 57mm, that's not entirely true. You get better alpha damage, but your penetration suffers. You get a better high explosive round, but you get quite a poor rate of fire given the alpha damage, and your DPM isn't great. And its accuracy is terrible. So actually, whilst you might have this gun unlocked, you might be looking at that thinking, I really don't want to use that gun. And that would be fair enough. So, unfortunately, if that's the situation you find yourself in, you now have the turret as an obstacle before you can get anything better. So realistically, unless you're going to drop some free experience, you're probably going to have to unlock this turret, probably with the 57mm gun, which is a bit of a painful experience. Now, the turret is only 2,500 experience. This is one of those times when I think using a little bit of free XP might actually be a good idea. The next gun in the line is not used on a previous tank unless you've already gone up the Japanese heavy tank line, which you won't have done because you need to get through this tank to get there. So, this is a 75mm gun, again, but you've got 115 alpha damage, your penetration goes from 87 to 90, your premium penetration does go down a little bit though, do bear that in mind. Your rate of fire is lower with lower alpha damage. DPM is atrocious. The accuracy is bad, but it's not that much worse than the 57mm gun. I mean, again, this is not a good gun, but you might want to consider using it to do the rest of your grinding with, and then you can finally get round to unlocking the top gun. If you don't wish to use any of these guns other than the top one, then unfortunately you're going to find yourself having to drop quite a lot of free experience. So to get straight to this gun, you're looking at, what was it, 2,500 for that 75mm, sorry, for the turret, plus another, plus... Where's it showing? There we go. So it's 2,500 plus 2,350, so that's about 5,000 experience. And then for the top gun, that's another 3,800. So you're looking at about 9,000 experience to get your way up to that top gun. Don't worry too much about that DPM value, that's with the stock turret, which you won't be using at that point. But prioritise the gun as quickly as you can. Then you can worry about, I guess, the engine, the tracks. Get the tracks whatever you need to get the greater load limit. And the radios shouldn't be your priority, but I imagine you'll probably... I mean, that one you use on Bleeding Everything. This one is used all over the shop, and the top radio... Type 1 Sheehy, you'll already have unlocked, so it really doesn't matter. So, gun, suspension, and engine, basically. There. Once you've got this thing fully unlocked, what sort of equipment and crew skills should you be looking at? Well, I think there's a couple of choices here. Remembering that as this is a tier 5, for equipment you don't get a specialised slot that will give you better performance for an appropriate bit of equipment in that slot. You don't get that till tier 6. Now, the equipment I've got on this tank is kind of left over from pre-equipment 2.0. And I think you could tweak this a little bit. Gun rammer, I do think, is a good bet. I've got vents. You could swap vents out for an improved rotation mechanism. Just bear in mind that as this is a tier 5, the gun handling is not very good, and taking shots on the move is always going to be hit or miss. Emphasis on the miss. But you could use an improved rotation mechanism instead. I've gone for the vents because that just makes your performance at longer range that little bit better, as it just all-round buffs your vehicle, including the accuracy of the gun and whatnot. You could try using a turbocharger, but honestly, I'm not convinced by it. And I would strongly suggest something to boost up your view range. It really helps, especially when you are not top tier, as your view range is not great. I mean, mine says 462, but your base view range is racking up at about 350, if memory serves. Fully upgraded turret, 350 base view range, which is quite, you know, it's not terrible for a tier 5 medium tank, but it's not great. Consumables, I've got nothing fancy here. Med kit, repair kit, and automatic fire extinguisher, because since they were nerfed, the manual fire extinguisher is now terrible. Just as a quick note, in case anyone's ever wondering, I always put the first aid kit in the 4 slot and the repair kit in the 5 slot, because then that means double tapping 5 puts my tracks back on, and double tapping 4 puts my driver back in. And I find that sort of movement are the sort of things that you really want to prioritise. So in terms of consumables, really nothing special here. I've got a first aid kit, a repair kit, and automatic fire extinguisher, because manual fire extinguishers suck these days. This thing doesn't particularly set on fire that much. I wouldn't drop either of the other two because it's quite fragile, and losing crew members or modules does definitely happen. Could you drop the fire extinguisher for something? I guess you could, but the question is, what would you drop it for? There's no point, I don't think, having 2 first aid kits or 2 repair kits, and then you're left with quality oil or onigiri, and you could do either of those, I suppose, especially the onigiri, but it's only tier 5. Do you really want to? I mean, this thing can be a good little credit maker, if you want it to be. So, whilst you could go for those, I wouldn't recommend it. Like a pretty standard loadout here should be fine. Quick note on the fire extinguisher. Manual fire extinguishers are rubbish these days, hence I'm using the automatic one, but generally speaking, missions fire so many automatic fire extinguishers at you, you don't tend to find yourself having to actually buy any, in my experience. In terms of crew skills, this is not a crew that was specifically intended for the Chinu. They're just hopping around the Japanese tech tree, picking up aces in machines that I don't have aces in yet. What would I recommend? Well, nothing outlandish. It's going to be the standard recommendation. Sixth Sense is your friend, Repairs is your friend, Brothers in Arms is your friend. Camo, though, I think, for the Japanese medium tanks, they're so lightly armoured. I think you can make a good case for taking camouflage skill, snapshot, smooth ride, you know, the standard good stuff. Again, this is only a tier 5. Unless you're keeping this, which I don't think most people are, you're probably not going to have a particularly outstanding crew, so I wouldn't get too hung up on the exact crew skills that you've got. Sixth Sense is your friend. Above and beyond that, you can probably pick and choose to some degree. I haven't noticed any particular ammo rack problems or any particular other problems that you'd want to compensate for by using crew skills, apart from the fact that the gun handling's a bit meh, but it's a tier 5 medium tank, the gun handling is generally a bit meh. And I think, having said all of that, it's time for me to stop waffling and time for us to have a look at some gameplay. Here we are with our first match then, and this is on the Glacier map. This is a 5-10 matchmaking setup, which, being a tier 5, is the best you're going to get, effectively, because you don't see tier 3s, so you get +2, -1 matchmaking, which is endless fun. You don't see tier 3s anymore. For anyone who hasn't played the game for a while, you used to, but you don't anymore. It was a bit rough on the tier 3s, to be fair. We're here on Glacier, and you might have noticed there's only mediums and tank destroyers in this match. No artillery, no light tanks, no heavy tanks. Fine. Coming down the hill there, we get up to a startling, 38, 39 kilometers an hour going downhill. To be fair, we managed to keep that speed up until we get to an incline. But yeah. So we're just coming up to the ridgeline here, see if we can spot some people out and possibly get some shots on them, and we can put a shot into that P26. The issue, of course, here is that we weren't particularly quick, because this tank isn't particularly quick. I'm really pushing my luck here. That's dicey, but the shot lands. We weren't particularly quick, and so there's the very real chance here that, and I've experienced this with some other tanks I've tried this exact thing in, there's the very real chance that you won't actually manage to really spot anything coming to this mid-ridge so relatively late. Generally people try this in a much faster machine so that you can spot out often things like heavies that are crossing the map. But anyway, put a shot into that Stug. I think we're going to go for a blind shot here because frankly why not, he might still be there, and pretty sure we hit him by the looks of it, and someone else, our Matilda as it turns out, picks up the kill. So we're 2 kills to 0 up. And definitely in this sort of matchmaking, like, this is very nice. We trade shots with the enemy Chino. Our gun is perfectly up to the task. In fact, I would claim the gun on this thing is perfectly up to the task. As long as you play intelligently, even in a tier 7 match. 125 penetration is enough to get flanking shots. Just checking. 124, sorry. Ooh, Panzer 4C. Again, I'm pushing this a little bit. Is this all going to go hideously wrong? I put a shot into him, but I take a bigger hit from an Su-85, and then an M10 tank destroyer firing high explosive, which actually takes my track out, which is kind of irritating, and I eat another shot from the Su-85B there. So when working this mid-ridge, lesson to you all, you do have to be a little bit careful, otherwise someone is going to slap you in the face, especially with, look at all those tank destroyers, you know. We started this match, both teams, with 11 tank destroyers. Sorry, the enemy team started with 10, my bad. Hetzer, seeing if I can get a shot on him. I take the shot early because I didn't think I was going to have an opportunity to aim properly, and as it is, the guy dies. And but we're still able to, we're not able to put the damage in on him. This looks like it's going to be a little bit of a one-sided game, and I might be able to get a bit of revenge on that Su-85B who shot me earlier on. He goes dark, but going for the blind shot. That shot went wide, but it might just have clipped the back of his tank. I'm going to go for another one. That one definitely didn't hit. This guy's moved. I'm going to take a third one just for good measure, but he's moved. You can tell because you can see the puffs of earth, I suppose, as the shell hits the ground. Now I'm on 206 health. That makes me essentially a 2-shot for most of the enemy tanks. Any of the enemy who are using sort of howitzers, so potentially the Hetzer for example, or the IKV-103, they could take me out with a single shot. But generally speaking, I'm going to be a 2-shot for these guys. Taking another blind shot there, you can see it doesn't hit anything, and going for a blind shot on the top position, because often people will return to a position they were in previously, but no. Nothing happening. So 9-2, it looks like we're going to win this fairly convincingly. It would take the enemy team quite something to turn this around. So really we're kind of now onto the farming stages of this match. Trying to get as much damage as we can without dying. That would be nice. So, firstly, Matilda Black Prince is up there. I know that machine's slow, but, geez. Going for it here, if I get shot by the SU, I get shot. I just want to try and get some more damage and more experience out of this game. We're up to 704 damage so far, which is at least more damage than we have hit points, so there's that, but, you know, I'm not going to get too excited by 740 damage. We take a hit there from the M10, who rolls fractionally high. His average damage, I think, is 115 off the top of my head. Although that is the premium variant, the RBFM, maybe that one has slightly different alpha damage with a slightly different gun, but I wouldn't be surprised if it was the same 115. Going for a shot on the guy, we actually bounce on him, probably hit a dubious angle. I mean, we didn't have the shot fully aimed, so that's fair enough. But we do get some lovely assistance damage on the guy there, so I'm not complaining, it all counts towards experience. Matilda Black Prince has gone down, that just leaves this IKV and the SU-85B. So, because we've pushed up here, although we're not really... I mean, we are picking up some extra damage ourselves, but it's really the assistance we're picking up here that's nice. And it looks like we actually fired a HE round there on the guy. And that thing is very lightly armoured, but if memory serves, I think I was primarily just trying to keep the guy tracked to guarantee that I would get the assistance there. But anyway... loaded an SU-85? Jesus, that's not how this works. Loaded a HE round for the SU-85, and I'm going to see if I can come up behind this guy and give him a little bit of a rogering from the rear. We'll see how that goes. And no, it looks like the SU-85 has pushed forward. He wants to feed the Hetzer and the Panzer Soufflé 1C instead of feeding me, which is very sad, but there we go. So that was the match. Nothing too spectacular, just sort of a steady game there, clocking in at around about 6 minutes. It's not a particularly long game, but you know, just able to kind of do our thing, and we were down to a one-shot by the end, so we weren't exactly camping at the back. Let's have a look at the post-game stats. So that ended up being enough there for a second-class mastery and a fire for effect ribbon. Like I said, nothing hideously spectacular, but just some kind of steady, consistent gameplay there. And actually, as we're going to see in the moment from the damage count, although we saw a shade under 1,000 damage, we actually did a little bit more than that, and it looks like we might have hit 2 blind shots. So just having a quick look at who they could have been on, and shots that I don't remember taking. Looks like one shot might have been on that Panzer Soufflé 1C, and one shot I am thinking... Who was the other one? We saw the 3 on the P26, saw the 1 on the SU, we saw the... and one maybe on that Stug, potentially when he went blind. Or when he went dark, I should say, and we took a blind shot on him. So, when you've got the opportunity, blind shots here or there can definitely be helpful. And as you can see, we actually managed 1,252 damage in that game. Came the top of our team. 1 kill, 635 base experience. Like I said, nothing that's going to make you look at it and go, oh, wow. But as many of you will know, and I'm just trying to remind people, I don't tend to show spectacular games in these reviews. Shout out to the enemy team, or the enemy Jacka2222 in his M10 RBFM. 1167 damage and a kill from him is a fairly respectable performance, just not enough to carry his team. And shout out to our friendly Matilda, over 1,000 damage from him, despite the fact that he was not top tier, kind of putting to bed a little bit that whole claim of, oh no, the Matilda only works when it's top tier. Well, no, the Matilda still has a very good gun. 17 shots fired, 11 hits, 10 penetrations for that damage count. 400 from over 300 metres, but most of it was actually from relatively close range. We received 5 hits, of which 1 didn't penetrate. That was the HE round from the M10 there. But the rest did penetrate. You really don't expect the armour to do much on this tank, except possibly prevent HE rounds from penetrating occasionally. 3 enemy vehicles spotted, 6 damaged, 1 destroyed, 678 assistance damage, and a little over 2 kilometres travelled in that 6-minute match. And with the standard account, that was enough for basically an 18,000 credit profit. Bearing in mind there was an extra 1,100 credits in there from the Holiday Ops Christmas New Year event thing. So if you take that away, you're looking at somewhere in the region of 17,000 credits on a standard account, and on a premium account you're looking at somewhere in the region of 28,000 credits plus another 3,000 for your reserve. Decent amount of experience there. Not quite sure where that 5,000 extra experience came from specifically, but it came from somewhere, completing a mission or something. But otherwise it would have just been 635 base XP, with a little bit of free XP thrown in, of course. So that was our Tier 5 game. As usual, I'm also going to show you a game where we are not at the top of the team list at all. So here we go for our bottom tier match then. It's a Tier 7 game and we are here on the steps, of course it is. Now, I actually had some difficulty trying to find a Tier 7 match from the ones I played that I wanted to showcase as part of this review, because I found that in my Tier 7 games, either they just didn't really show you much about this tank. Either the games were so good that I didn't really want to show them in a review, like my Ace game that I'll get around to showing you at some point was a Tier 7 match. I didn't really want to show that in a review because I don't think it's very helpful to show exceptional games in reviews like this. Or they had a tendency to just be so one-sided one way or the other that the only thing you'd really glean from it is the Chinu isn't particularly quick, and you don't need a specific replay just to show you that. So I've gone with this game, and this isn't the sort of game that people would normally show in any sort of review, because essentially our impact on the game isn't going to be very big. We're going to get till kind of the end of the game and things are going to sort of run away a little bit, and we're going to be a bit too slow to keep up. But we're going to then be in that sort of situation that, okay, well, we've been a bit too slow to keep up, now what? What do we do about it? How can we possibly glean as much as we can from this match in a relatively short period of time? That's what I'm going to try and get at in this game. So, like I said, Tier 7 match. It's, instead of 3-5-7, it's like 4-5... I can't be bothered to do the math, 6 or something like that. So, matchmaking is a little bit wonky. There's the M4A1FL10, the new Tier 6 French premium medium tank. Well, new if you're playing this game on the PC. I believe console players have had that thing for a while. Looks like an interesting little tank. It's basically a French AMX-13 light ton turret, complete with auto-loading magazine, slapped on top of a Sherman hull. It doesn't look particularly overpowered or anything, but it looks like a fairly decent tank, and it looks like he might be dead soon, and the Valiant picks up the kill. So, you can see we're playing this cautiously, because at the end of the day we're a slow tank. If we get spotted, we have terrible armour, and we're going to get deleted very quickly. So, I don't recommend that you camp base or anything, but primarily, again, as I've said earlier on in this review, your focus is on the gun and the firepower of this thing, and you want to just sort of be a damage support a lot of the time, especially when you're not top tier. So already you can see the scoreline 6-3, and we're only 2.5 minutes, or a little over 2.5 minutes into this game. But I still don't want to go too aggressively, because this thing is fragile at the end of the day. And I'm aware that we've got, well, we know about the T-34-1 was last spotted on this flank. He's a Tier 7 medium tank, so top tier. There's the IS, oh dear. And whilst there are 4 of us over here, if you have a look, one of the Valiants and the DSPZ-ins, I don't know how to pronounce that, sorry. The Polish medium tank over there, they're one-shots for pretty much anyone. Now I'm spotted here. I was trying to see if I could get some shots maybe into the flank of that IS, but it's just not really working. And a Super Hellcat picks up a kill on our low health Valiant, which indicates there might be a Super Hellcat, oh, and then he shoots me. A Super Hellcat up at sort of that ridge line at kind of A7. So, thankfully, that shot only goes into my tracks, burn my repair kit, put my tracks back on, because this game is all about realism, right? The scoreline is 9-4. Like I said, this game has kind of gotten away from us. So, I was pondering going down to help those medium tanks against the T-34-1, but if I do that, well, there's a very good chance he'll kill them before I kind of turn up, and I'll just die, and it'll all be messy, and I'll expose myself to shots from that Super Hellcat. So instead, Super Hellcat is spotter-rated. Can I get some damage on this guy? Aim, 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 and there we go. 134, slightly high damage roll, we will take it. Gonna go for a blind shot. Maybe it hits, maybe it doesn't. And we're up to 526 damage. Oh no, that one did hit. 132 onto him. Can we pick up the kill? No, we can't. So we're up to 658 damage. Now, although this is a bit of a quick game, it was like 11-8. It's not so far gone that the enemy would have serious problems pulling it back. And if you look at the tanks they've got left, 2 of them were, right up until that Super Hellcat was killed, 3 of them were top tier. So going for a shot on that Panzer IV, we miss. The IS dies to our T-29, and now we've just got the Panzer IV and the T-34-1, and it looks like I might get a Rectal Chinese medium tank. So, I've only done 658 damage. I'm just going to pause it here. Only done 658 damage as the Panzer IV dies. Which is more than I've got hit points, but it's not that impressive. So, what can I do to maximise my experience here? I'm probably only going to get a chance to put a shot or 2 into that T-34-1, which is like 250 damage if I get 2 penetrating shots, which would bring my damage count up to about 900, which isn't awful. But how can I maximise that? Well, what about if I track the guy? That was my thinking. I didn't actually care if I did any damage here or not, but if I keep the guy tracked, I'm going to get assistance damage, and that one I'll just put into the front of his hull because he's about to die. I pick up the assistance damage for my allies killing him, and suddenly, in addition to, what, about 250 odd damage, something in that ballpark, I also managed to pick up 614 assistance, so trying to squeeze the game at the end there for as much as we possibly can. And that is the game. Again, not a particularly long one, but let's have a look at the post-game stats. There we go then, that was enough for another second class mastery badge and another Fire for Effect ribbon, which was alright, to be fair, given how things went. 914 damage, no kills, 528 base experience, so we still finished, what, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6th on the team by XP, which isn't too bad. 13 shots fired, 8 hits, 7 pens for that 914 damage, most of it was from pretty long range. 2 hits received, 1 penned, 1 didn't, but that wasn't our armour, that was just, it blew our tracks off and didn't actually do any damage to us. So armour did nothing, again. 3 enemy vehicles damaged, none destroyed, but we did manage that 614 assistance damage, and if we go back to the first screen, you can see all of that assistance damage was the tracking on that T-34-1, right at the end. 1.51 kilometres travelled in a 5-minute 20 game. Yeah, like I said, the games I had in this thing, especially Tier 7 ones, were quite swingy. That's not necessarily something I've noticed to an exorbitant amount, regardless of the tank I was playing. It's just I happened to have a few of them at the time. 16,500 credit profit, but again, bear in mind, if you're looking at how much money this thing's going to make, that includes 2,500 credits from holiday ops, so 14,000 credit profit with a standard account, and if you were looking at the premium performance, that's, let's do some mental maths time, somewhere in the region of a 22,000 credit profit and 3,000 to your reserve. And again, completed a mission, I think it was the Queen Maeve missions at the time, that were giving me more XP, I think, but don't quote me on that, I might be talking nonsense. Either way, that was the game, so let's just go and have a chat about this thing in the garage. So, what are my thoughts on the Chi-Nu? Well, so I was actually pleasantly surprised on rebuying this thing. It's been quite a long time since I played through the Japanese tech tree, and I have made my way up to tier 10 in it, though I've not played that many games in the STB one. And I kind of went through the lower tiers relatively quickly, because at the time when I was playing it, it was released during the middle of one of Wargaming's early premium tank marathons. I think it was for the IS-6, and to get the tank, you could only accumulate experience at tier 6, so I basically blitzed my way up when it was released to tier 6 in the Japanese line, which was the Chi-To. The heavy tanks didn't exist at the time, and played that a lot, but it meant that I kind of neglected the Chi-Nu at tier 5. And it's not a bad tank. Well, no, that's a lie. It is actually quite a bad tank, but it has quite a good gun. And that really is the defining feature of this thing. For a tier 5 medium tank, it has a rather tasty gun. And I find often this tank gets overlooked in discussions about good tier 5 vehicles, or even good tier 5 medium tanks. And I think that's a little unfair, because it does exist, let's be honest, and it's not bad. Having said that, I can see why people tend to forget about this, because let's be honest, it's not a Sherman or a Panzer IV that can mount a 10.5cm howitzer. It's not a T-34 with its hilarious rate of fire. And so I can see why it gets overlooked. But I guess what I'm saying is, if you've never played this tank, or you played through it a long time ago, it might be worth a visit or a revisit and see what you think of it these days. I actually had a good time playing it, although the marks of excellence on this thing display weirdly. That's bizarre. Just compare it to the premium variant for a moment. That's how the sort of thing they should display as. This just looks like it's italicized. Anyway, that aside. Yeah, it might be worth a revisit. I'm not going to keep it, because I already own the Chinu Kai, which is a very, very similar machine, slightly worse, really, but similar enough that I'm not going to keep the base Chinu. But, like I said, I had fun playing it, and you might want to give it a look. So there we go. There are my thoughts on the Tier 5 Japanese medium tank, the Chinu. Hope you guys enjoyed this video, possibly found it vaguely informative. If you did, by all means feel free to catch some of my other videos and or subscribe to my channel. You will. You can also support me on Patreon. Various links to Discord, Patreon, whatever, are in the description. And I wish you very happy hunting on that battlefield. And a happy new year. Ciao, ciao.